happened in April 2020 in Santiago de Chile. The deputies of the Chilean Parliament discussed the same issue that pretty much everyone was talking about on that day throughout the whole world: how to stop the spread of, at the time, new coronavirus, COVID-19. A most interesting and instructive discussion of the usual high standard of excellence ensued, as James Joyce would say. The one, however, who conquered the public with a magnificent oration eloquently and forcibly expressed was a representative of Cámara de Diputadas y Diputados, Jorge Alessandri Vergara. "Last night I read a novel," he said. "A famous novel. Its author is known under the name of Miguel, and there was a line that somewhat reminds me of what is happening now in our parliament. I'm referring to the unique episode when Don Quixote de la Mancha says to his squire Sancho Panza, 'Let the dogs bark, Sancho. It's a sign that we're moving forward.'" Jorge Alessandri impressed the public with outstanding presentation, but the technical merit could have been improved, since Don Quixote de Cervantes never said such a thing in the novel. Bienvenidos to the new episode of our most literary channel. My name is Armen Zakarian, and here we talk about books as a way of moving forward. Brace yourself, because today we are going on a risky journey with our good old Don Quixote de la Mancha, searching for the origins of this most popular pseudo-Cervantes quote of all times. We'll slip down in the deep hollow of the shadowy Montesinos cave of misquoting, since the instruments of darkness, as Macbeth was once informed, oftentimes tell us truth. This would be the first of a series of episodes. Well, I hope you'll like it, and it really will be a series, where we will debunk several famous and well-known literary quotes whose authenticity, as they would say in the European Parliament, evokes deep concern. And we start with this one: "Let the dogs bark, Sancho. It's a sign that we're moving forward." Apparently, Jorge Alessandri wasn't the first one to quote this pseudo-Cervantian punchline. For once at least, this phrase was even used by a whole head of a state. It was La Presidenta Argentina Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, who trumped her opponents with the following statement: "I've remembered Cervantes when he says to Sancho, 'They bark, Sancho, it's a sign we're moving forward.' I will present you my own version. 'They bark, Sancho, it's a sign that they are dogs.'" It's quite ironic that precisely the country that gave us Jorge Luis Borges, one of the big-time postmodernists of the last century, should have ended up with a president who is, ojo, paraphrasing a fake quote. How postmodernist is that, dear Umberto Eco? However, we should note that this is, in general, quite often among the politicians. They rarely appreciate us, people of letters. They always keep their lawyers and PR specialists close, but I personally don't know any politician that would hire a professional philologist just to have one around. Maybe that's why another former president of Argentina, Carlos Menem, once said that his number one hero had always been Robinson Crusoe, because he has robbed from the rich and given to the poor. Poor Friday, I suppose. However, let's get back to Quixote. The main miscalculation of those who used this famous fake quote is the reference to the original story, the very novel of Cervantes, where there's no such phrase, and nothing even close to that. Those who were more insightful, if I may say so, or better said, ingenious, as Don Quixote himself, usually used a wiser phrasing. For example, as Don Quixote once said to his squire Sancho Panza. You see, without mentioning Cervantes. Because, yes, Don Quixote of Cervantes never said such a thing. However, he's not the only legitimate Don Quixote there is. You see, any cultural phenomenon of this extent accumulates and acquires apocrypha. And speaking, for example, of Dr. Faust, we should always specify what Faust do we mean. The most famous and influential Goethe's Faust, or Faust from The Tragical History of the Life and Death of Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, which was written more than 2 centuries before Goethe. Or maybe the 20th century metaphorical edition Dr. Faustus by Nobel Prize laureate Thomas Mann. All these Fausts are quite unlike. They have different character and judgment, different manners and fate. You can of course argue that Faust's variations is the result of a well-known story being developed in different ways by different authors, that it was a legend that gave life to so many artistic interpretations. And Don Quixote is, for its part, on the contrary, private property, if I may. It was Vladimir Nabokov who described Don Quixote, the character, as a stroke of genius on the part of Cervantes. Nabokov was not of a particular high opinion of the novel itself, but of its hero, yes. In one of his Harvard University lectures, he said, "Don Quixote looms so wonderfully above the skyline of literature, a gaunt giant on a lean nag, that the book lives, and will live through the sheer vitality that Cervantes has injected into the main character of a very patchy tale." And Miguel himself, who during his lifetime, while working on the 2nd volume of the novel, had already encountered the so-called false Quixotes, written and distributed by some tricksters, explicitly claimed his intellectual property rights. He wrote, "Para mí solo nació Don Quixote y yo para él. Él supo obrar y yo escribir. For me alone Don Quixote was born, and I for him. His was the power of action, mine of writing." But one might as well try to hold the wind or the sunlight in their hands. Don Quixote came of age and left his family home in the 17th century, and since then their independent odyssey with Sancho Panza had begun. You see, Don Quixote left the pages of Cervantes and started to live his own life, an apocryphal one. And few centuries later we find him as a fully independent figure open for dozens of interpretations. From one of the characters of Cervantes, he becomes one of the symbols of Spain. And there are even intellectuals and authors at the time who consider him to be a Spanish Christ. To put it simply, a national fictional character had become a global cultural phenomenon. And among dozens of interpretations of the hero, there is, of course, one that says the words we are looking for today. In Orson Welles' movie, which he ironically called "When Are You Going to Finish Don Quixote?" because he was working on the film for decades, and which was finished and released only after his death, there's an episode where a dog barks at Sancho. And Don Quixote says, "Leave him. When they bark, it means we're on our way." Orson Welles, one of the most talented and ingenious directors of the last century, was certainly no stranger to daring authorial interpretations. When he was filming Franz Kafka's The Process, he quite significantly changed the ending, and he even explained why, but that is an entirely different story. However, in his Don Quixote, there are, of course, plenty of inconsistencies with the text of the novel, because even a close-to-the-text staging is already an interpretation. Menos mal, the film of Orson Welles, which is an act of Quixotismo in itself. And clearly, there are also lines that, just like Robinson Crusoe, Welles robs from the rich and gives to the poor. For example, the Duchess helper in the book says, "The truth will always rise above falsehood as oil above water." But Orson Welles, in the movie, puts this phrase in the mouth of Sancho. Anyway, Orson Welles' Quixote includes this barking dogs thing, and therefore you can safely refer to it, as long as you don't stress that you've read it from Cervantes. Case closed, could have said we. However, there's a tiny detail that we must mention. Orson Welles was not the one who came up with the idea. It appears that he just followed an existed before tradition of attributing these words to Quixote. As I mentioned earlier, Orson Welles never completed his work. The movie was finished by the director Jesus Franco and released only in 1992. And the custom of attributing this line to Quixote existed long before Welles's movie was released. For instance, in the repertoire of one of the Argentinian theaters in 1990, there was a play with the name of Ladran Sancho, they bark Sancho, which is the first part of the line in question in Spanish. Ladran Sancho, señal que cabalgamos. And if you wish, you can find plenty of such mentions earlier. For instance, an Uruguayan newspaper on the 6th of June of 1986 placed the Ladran Sancho punchline on one of its pages. The following mini-investigation led us to the interesting results. It seems that at the basis of this phrase is a proverb: the dogs bark, but the caravan goes. Its origins are unclear, but most probably it came from the East. The most often mentioned possible origins are Turkish and Arabian. It is also unknown when exactly it originated. The first mentions in the written sources that we know start to appear from 15th century, but the proverb itself, one can assume, existed before. It's quite remarkable that only the barking dogs in different variations of the proverb usually remained intact. The rest was taking turns. Before Quixote and Sancho, in front of those ghosted dogs passed caravans, noblemen, and even planets. For instance, Andrea Alciato, Italian author of the 16th century, uses the proverb in a way that the dogs are barking at the moon, and the moon is just flying across the sky. Anyhow, at the beginning of the 20th century, this catchphrase is already well known and frequently appears in literature. For example, describing a dinner that took place in France at the end of the 19th century in the second volume of his In Search of the Lost Time, Marcel Proust writes, "In the words of a fine Arab proverb, the dogs may bark, the caravan goes on." That is, however, was not Proust who gave this phrase away to a broad cultural context, but the German genius Goethe. Well, at least this is our most likely assumption. In 1808, Goethe writes a short poem called Klaffe, Yelping Dogs or The Yelpers, a poem dedicated to his fellow critics. Hear how it goes. Our rides in all directions bend for business or for pleasure, yet yelpings on our steps attend and barking without measure. The dog that in our stable dwells after our heels is striding, and all the while his noisy yells but show that we are riding. One is drawn to add, Sancho. We are riding Sancho. And someone, we don't know who that was, did. Apparently, somewhere in the first half of the 20th century, this phrase, already a commonplace at the time, was complemented by the name of Sancho and put into the mouth of Quixote. Apparently, this happened somewhere in the Spanish-speaking world. However, by the middle of the century, the happy conjunction of this phrase with the image of Quixote was completed. For example, in 1945, a certain Argentinian engineer, Juan Sabato, accompanies his article on a national electricity policy with an epigraph with this very phrase: Ladran Sancho, señales de que cabalgamos. Dogs bark Sancho, the sign we are moving forward. You see, this line was so applicable to the character of ingenious Hidalgo that somewhere in the first half of the 20th century, Don Quixote simply caught it. But many years later, Orson Welles did us a great favor. He made the de jure in correspondence to de facto. He courageously grabbed this line of an apocryphal Don Quixote from the crowd and put it into the mouth of his Don Quixote, making it all official. Well, I guess it is true what Picasso used to say: Good artist copies, great artist steals. Oh wait, was it Faulkner? Or Stravinsky maybe? We'll get to that later. Thanks for watching. Please share your favorite fake quotes in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this video. And remember, your like for us is a sign that we're moving forward. Call me Armin, and I'll see you next time.